Welcome. I'm Barbara Marcum, the Director of the Senior Resources Department for the City of Westland. With me today, I have Jim Vermeulen from the Vermeulen Sieski Funeral Home and Stephen Kish, and who has been a funeral planner for 40 years. A lot of experience there.
Very much so. Very, very much so.
Anyway, Jim, I wanted to start it with you because I have noticed, and especially for me in the last 10 years, I've noticed that when I was younger, there would be, somebody would pass away, it'd be 4 days at the funeral home, it was a more long drawn out process, to literally an afternoon visitation and maybe a funeral that day, or 1 day visitation and the funeral the next day, or just a 1 day memorial, go in, look at the pictures, you know, express your sorrow and move on. I'm sure you've noticed the difference. If I've noticed it, you're in the business.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I've been a funeral director about 35 years, so I didn't ever experience the 4 day funerals. 3 days was kind of the common, the standard. 2 days of viewing, or maybe a day and a half, third day funeral. And that certainly has changed to, I would say, the standard today is 1 day viewing, second day funeral. But as you mentioned, many times people might have a couple hours of gathering or viewing, followed by the service yet that same afternoon or possibly that evening. And I think some people think that, oh, if we do it in 1 day, it's going to be half the cost of 2 days. Well, that's not really true. It might be a little bit less, but it's not going to be a double in whether you have a 1 or a 2 day event. Sometimes I think people just get in a bit of a hurry. Our whole life is kind of hurried, and I think that is maybe transitioning into how we handle our funerals. I think it can be a mistake if people try to rush through it too quickly. People need to sometimes stop, take a breath, and kind of work through it. When you've got a big decision to make, you know, buying a house, taking a job change, you'll probably not make a snap decision. You'll sleep on it for a day or two. And you kind of let these emotions and those things work out. And I think time of a funeral, it can be helpful to do that. But we're never here to tell people what to do. We'll help them plan the best funeral, whether it's a 2-hour funeral or a 4 day funeral. But yes, funerals are tending to be happening a little more compact than they used to be.
Well, one thing I've noticed, and just me being at the Friendship Center, that several, and I can't say several, a few. There have been 3, maybe another one, but it's like we get notification, somebody who's been coming there for years, and all of a sudden it's like, well, you know, their family called, they passed away, what are the arrangements? They're not having anything. It's been at least 3 or 4 people literally in the last couple of years that don't want anything. And so for me, there are many things that I look at. The societal change on grieving and saying goodbye. It's like we kind of are a throwaway society, and it's like, well, is it getting, these are the things I'm thinking and mulling over. I don't know that it's true, but I'm thinking, okay, well, you think of, well, you know, blah, 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 was old, lived their life, and whatever, you know, just going, and so I don't know if it's minimizing the life that was lost, or whether it's because people are so busy and you're cramming everything in. And I mean, all the way around, I don't think it's a good thing. The people who are grieving, like you said, emotionally, grief can last, and I've done a lot of reading on that and worked a lot in hospice undergraduate, but you know, that loss and that, I'm wondering if the bonds between people are changing, or because I look at a life and I think how special everyone's lives are, and that celebration and the looking and the honoring that, it bothers me that it's just so quick. And I see the difference, and I have seen the difference in a matter of years, and it's like, is it societal? Is it money? Is it because we're fast driven, or is it because of the changes in our relationships? And I know that you've seen it too.
Yeah, and the reasons I think are all those you mentioned. I think it's not one thing. I think it's a combination of a lot of things. Some people will express the desire to have no funeral.
Yes.
I mean, you know, what I hear at the Christmas party is, oh, put me in a hefty bag and put me by the street. Well, some guys are joking, and it's often guys that will be real blunt like that. And then I'll say, now, is that what you'd want to do if your wife died? Well, no, I wouldn't just put her in a hefty bag by the street. Of course not. I said, well, then don't ask her to do that to
know.
you. You know? But some people think it's a money thing, that if they save, a few or several thousands of dollars, that's going to change their family's life. Most families, saving $2,000 to $8,000 or $10,000 isn't going to change their life. Now, it's still serious money. Everything in life costs money, but it's really an important event.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but to have no event versus some type of an event, whether there's viewing or no viewing or burial or cremation, lots of options, lots of ways to work within budgets and still have an event that you can celebrate and honor that life. And we get calls at the funeral home. People say, I heard, George Smith died. And, when's the funeral? And if we tell them there's not going to be a public event, they're just so disappointed.
Yes.
Because they want to honor him. They want to tell their family that they loved him and he was a great friend. And if people don't have that opportunity, I think they feel like they cheated, like they didn't matter. They weren't a good enough friend to have an event for. So you can create problems by eliminating everything. And often the person, who becomes the deceased thinks they're doing everybody a favor by skipping all that hard time. Well, you can't just skip grief. So you need to give yourself the opportunity for your family and your friends to grieve your loss, to honor your life, to celebrate your life. And it can be lots of different ways. And we encourage that. I like every funeral to be a little different than the next one.
Yeah.
If you're a bowler, bring your bowling trophies in. If you're a fisherman, prop the fishing poles and the pictures up there. We've had motorcycles parked not only out of the funeral home, inside the funeral home. And that's all great. Celebrate the life. And I think maybe some families aren't as close as they used to be. Sometimes we'll have fights and people carry those too strongly.
Problems. Yeah.
And then comes time for the funeral. I know we've had families that didn't do a funeral because they didn't all want to be in the building
together
the same
at the same
hour.
time.
That is sad.
Yeah,
and that's
really
a way
sad.
bigger question than just funeral directors can think about. But it is a bit of a commentary on our society that is sad.
Yes.
No matter what family issues there are, and every family has issues. That's just
There
life.
is no leave it to Beaver, Donna,
not-
Marie,
yeah.
Father knows best. We're all real families.
But hopefully we can put them to rest for a day or two or three, and let's get together. Let's honor the person that we're there about. And sometimes there's great healing at funerals too. People
Yes.
will realize, what?
Life can change on a dime.
Oh, we haven't
Maybe we better get it together.
Yeah, we may not have talked in 10 years, and then you realize how silly that is because one of us could be gone tomorrow, and we really wouldn't want to live the rest of our lives knowing that
And we had the guilt of
We've
not
had a big fight
rectifying
over-
that over something stupid. when
usually it
comes
is.
right- Yes.
Usually it is.
Yes.
So sometimes funerals can not only honor the deceased, but they can improve the lives of those
The
that are left behind.
relationships of the people who are left
Yep,
behind.
if they give them time, give themselves the opportunity to let that happen.
Well, Stephen, with that, and we're talking about different funerals in 2 days or, whatever, that's an awful pressuresome time. My mom passed away last December. I was thankful, even though we had to pick out cards in the obituary, we had plenty to do then, and I thought we wouldn't have anything to do, but we still had decisions to make, and there were still a lot of things to do. My mom and dad both pre-planned their funerals. I went with them, cried the whole time, but it was so much easier to go through that not having those decisions to make. And like when we talked about money or people thinking about that, not only planning your funeral earlier, costs of funerals don't seem to be going down, okay? So not only might it be a financial saving thing that you can do, but taking those responsibilities and for that person who's deceased now had to make those decisions take such a burden away from the people who are left behind, especially if they didn't want to talk about it. And you see that a lot. I don't want to talk about it. But then you're clueless as to what the person's needs or desires, are regarding, a funeral or what they want done after they're deceased. So let's talk a little bit about pre-planning and what a gift that is.
If you do not have an intentional plan in place, pre-planning a funeral, having a discussion, there are 75 to 125 decisions that need to be made in an extremely short period of time.
Wow, I didn't even know that many.
There are emotional decisions,
Yeah.
financial decisions, and most importantly, decisions you don't have the opportunity to do over.
Yeah.
On what is the worst day of your life, by losing someone who is extremely close to you, you would have to come in and sit with a funeral director for several hours, perhaps 3 to 5 hours,
Yeah.
going over and addressing the 75 to 125 different issues, if not even more. They're saying that it could even be going up as high as 150 issues now. So I like to go ahead and talk with my families and say, we deal with two types of families on a regular basis. We deal with the family that says, I don't want to talk about it. I'm going to let my kids make a decision what happens to me. Or we deal with the type of family that has gone ahead, sat down in advance of a death, had the discussion with their family, and then put everything into black and white in the funeral home. Of those two families, I don't know about you, Barbara, but I know which family I would much rather be. I'd rather be that family that would have those decisions made.
No question, but nobody thinks I could die tomorrow. You know what I mean? That's the problem. It's something that's easily procrastinated. You think, yes, I'm going to take care of that this year. Or next month, and next month turns into next year, and then years, months, and years go by, and it's just not something that's easily addressed. And I understand it's uncomfortable, but it's like those decisions that can be made. So if somebody decides that they do want to pre-plan a funeral, okay, I know that, say, there are a lot of decisions. What do they need to have decided before they decide to pre-plan a funeral?
I think the first thing they need to decide is, what is my family going to need to get through the grief process? The whole purpose of a funeral is for those people who are left behind.
Right.
Obviously, we can't do much for the person who's made the transition from this life to the next. However, the survivors are here. The funeral is the first step in trying to heal a broken heart.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so if somebody decides and they contact you and say, I want to pre-plan this funeral, do you have a list of things? What happens when they decide that? What if they think, I'm not ready? I don't know. Do I want to be buried? Do I want it to be cremated? Do you provide them with a list? Is that how they decide? Or should they have talked about burial or cremation? What are the minimal things that they need to start pre-planning? And do they have to pre-plan it all at once?
No, I'd like to go ahead and offer options to families.
Okay.
Every family is different. If they're leaning toward the idea of burial, if they're leaning toward cremation. And one of the questions I will ask each family is, what do you know exactly about the form of disposition you're looking at? What do you know about burial? What do you know about cremation? We'll talk. We'll perhaps have an education at that point. We'll give them the choices. We'll give them the options. And I will ask them, what does your family need? What do you think they're going to want? It isn't necessarily as much about what we want when the death occurs as much as what your family needs.
Exactly. Well, Jim, what are the options for burial or cremation? What is the difference, with afterwards? Like, obviously, if you're buried in a cemetery. What are the options for where you're buried if you don't have a cemetery plot, or your cremains? What are the options there?
Well, there are really three options: burial in the ground, entombment into a crypt, A crypt is something that goes in a
Above
building
ground?
above ground.
Okay.
The building is usually called a mausoleum. Traditionally, you would go inside the building and there'd be all the crypts inside.
Right.
Now they're building some mausoleums that are able to be a little more affordable, where you don't go inside a building, all the crypts are accessed from the outside. So if people don't like the idea of being on the ground,
Yes, I was going to say that.
but they don't want to be cremated,
Right.
they can go into a crypt and they're above ground, so they're not buried in the ground, but they also are not cremated. They're in a crypt. Those are often called garden crypts, where they open from the outside. So there's burial, there's entombment in a crypt above ground, or cremation. There are multitudes of options with cremation. After you're cremated, you can keep the cremains. Many people bury the cremains. The Catholic Church really requires, highly encourages them to be buried in a cemetery.
Is there a particular reason for that? Do you
Well,
know?
they believe, and I would very much agree, that those cremains should be honored or treated with respect and honor, just like you would the body of a deceased. So you wouldn't take a body and dump them in the garage or
I'm smiling
put
for
them
a
out
reason.
back.
I told my kids, put me in an urn,
Yeah.
and then when you go on vacation, do we have the dog? Do we have the diaper bag? Do we have mom? Let's go. I want to go.
Some people do that, and I'm not ever going to say that's wrong.
That's why I was smiling.
But they could also bring you along by bringing your pictures along. They don't necessarily have to bring your urn along. But there are lots and lots of options with urns.
Yeah.
They can be blasted off into outer space. They can be put into the ocean and made part of a reef. If somebody was a scuba diver or loved the beach.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things you do with cremains. But I think there is still a human need to have a place to go, and that's the advantage of a cemetery or a niche. A niche is like a little spot in the mausoleum, where a crypt is where a whole body goes. A niche is a small place for cremains.
Okay, financially, what's the difference between the cost to the family? I mean, if we're thinking pre-planning, that probably is a consideration.
Oh, sure. The one real important thing for people to understand is they can have a regular, normal funeral, whatever that means, and be buried, or have that same regular funeral and be cremated. It used to be thought that if you were cremated, it meant no funeral. That is very much not the case. It's never been the case, and especially today, people realize it's not the case. The vast majority of the cremations that we handle are preceded by a viewing and a funeral. And then instead of the hearse going to the cemetery where the body's buried, we drive to the crematory and the body's cremated. So the funeral cost is the funeral cost. The disposition, the burial, the crypt, or the cremation are tied in with the cost of the funeral, but they're really a separate decision. If you happen to be a veteran, then you can get a free grave, the closest of which is at the Great Lakes National Cemetery in Holly. The grave is paid for, the digging's paid for, the vault's paid for, the marker's paid for.
Great.
So cost-wise, that's a great option.
So for all the veterans out there.
Yeah,
And also the veteran's spouse.
exactly.
Oh, wow, that's great.
And or the veteran's minor dependent children, which isn't real common, but if
Well,
you have
could
the
be.
case, it could be. But yeah, the spouse is huge. Or people buy their own grave, or crypt. Crypts are, well, it depends. Crypts used to be significantly more expensive than burial. Now, if you consider the cost of the grave, the digging, the vault, and the marker, many times above ground garden crypt can be comparable. It just depends. Just like houses cost different prices in different communities, cemeteries vary as well. But it's not uncommon to spend $1,000 or $1,500 for a grave and $1,000 or $1,500 to dig the grave, and maybe another $1,000 or $1,500 for a marker. So it just, whereas a above ground crypt, all those are included because you don't need a separate vault, you don't need a headstone because the name goes right on the crypt. The cremation itself is just a few $100s.
Right.
So the cost of a direct cremation, when there is no ceremony or service, and that can be, $1,500 to $2,500 maybe, depending on urns and newspaper notices if you have them and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
A funeral with cremation, can vary from $5,000 to maybe $8,000, depending on all those details. And a funeral with burial, again, kind of like a wedding. How much do you include in the price of the funeral? Is the headstone part of the funeral? Is the cemetery part of the funeral? But the funeral services and casket could range in the $5,000 to $6,000 to $7,000 or more, range. And then if you have to buy cemetery property and digging and vault, that would be, could be $2,000 to $4,000 more.
I'd really like a beautiful place, but I could care less if it was a wooden box. That's probably what I would prefer.
For the casket?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I want a pretty place. I want
a pretty cemetery.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I want. Yeah.
Most people would like it to be pretty. Sure, why not? If your family's going to come and visit, you'd like it to be a pleasant place, for sure.
Well, okay. Now that we're talking about actual different costs of things, Stephen, I went online because I thought, okay, if I'm cremated, I want to look at what my options are, and I like bronze. So I looked at the bronze things and thought, okay, they actually had one. I thought, this is nice. They have the cremains in the bottom and a place where you can put a candle, so you could put it by your fireplace and light a candle or whatever. And I thought, this is nice. How much is this? And I looked down, it was like $6,300. Bronze has gone up a lot since, well, I never even actually looked at it, but I've been told bronze has gone through the ceiling. So with markers and different things, and also the other thing I was going to say is I went through this old cemetery in back of the church in the Irish Hills, and you couldn't even see the names anymore. So what's the difference in markers and what they use and what they used to use, and what is the cost? Is it marble or granite more expensive, bronze more expensive, or how does that work?
First of all, Barbara, the cemeteries designate what type of markers they will allow in their cemetery. Some cemeteries are going to be bronze markers only. Some are going to be the flat.
Okay.
Some are going to be granite markers, either flat or the upright. Some have no designation, meaning you can bring whatever you would like into the cemetery. It used to be such that the cost of a flat granite marker was equivalent to the cost of a flat bronze marker. Nowadays, unfortunately, that has changed. The cost of bronze has skyrocketed. Bronze markers are about 90% copper. Since there is a glut on the world's market of copper, as the Asian countries are starting to become more industrialized, the cost of copper is going up, raising the cost of the bronze marker.
Oh, wow. Okay, so do they use granite? Do they use marble?
Originally, cemeteries started to use sandstone. It was easy to carve, and they found out that sandstone just did not weather in a very
Are those
nice,
the
old-fashioned
markers
ones
that you see that you can barely
You can
discern
barely
the
read
name?
anything. There's
Yeah.
cracks in them.
Yeah.
Someone then decided to go to marble. The drawback with marble is an extremely porous substance. Marble will discolor very easily. They then moved on to granite. Granite is the second hardest substance known to man after diamonds in a naturally occurring scenario.
in nature.
So now we're using the granite markers. They sandblast the dates, names, epitaphs into them. They use laser etching to put photographs on them.
I did
The
see
granite
one of those.
marker is probably the best value as far as your markers today. Now, again, a veteran is entitled to a free flat marker if they go to a private cemetery, or an upright marker if they go to the National Cemetery. If a veteran opts to use a private marker rather than the VA-provided marker, the VA then has what is referred to as a veteran's medallion. It's a bronze circular emblem of a folded American flag with the inscription on it saying Veteran, United States Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, whatever the branch of service. So if you're utilizing a private marker, you could then have that VA medallion placed on there indicating that that deceased was an honorably discharged veteran. So you either have the choice of using the VA-provided marker or the medallion, free of charge to the veteran's family.
And markers, whatever they are, for a family that's doesn't have a veteran, that is a decision that is, whatever they decide, does that usually go in with the funeral cost, or is that excluded from the
We could
funeral
place it
cost?
into the funeral costs. Most of the time, people opt not to place it into a pre-planned funeral because there would be a charge for the final date engraving onto
Right.
it after the death occurs.
Okay. Jim, I've always wondered this. Who owns the cemeteries? So if somebody gets a plot, okay, so technically you own the plot, right? The ground that you're buried in, or no?
Well, usually what you own is you don't actually own the real estate. You own the right to bury usually one human person in that grave. Because if you owned the real estate like you owned a plot of land, you could maybe do anything you want with it. Well, cemeteries don't want people building sheds on their graves.
Right.
They want it to people to be
I
buried
see
there.
the problem and the issue
So
there.
for practical purposes, you own it. For real estate attorneys, you own the right to bury a person in it, usually. Now, cemeteries can be owned by churches, they can be owned by municipalities, or they can be privately owned. Now, there has been a trend for a lot of the cemeteries to be bought up by some big corporate groups across the country, which,
Why would you be interested in owning a cemetery, out of curiosity?
well, 50 years ago, they weren't that attractive because they really weren't seen as money makers. They were a city or sometimes just a group of citizens would say, hey, we need a better cemetery in our little town. Let's pool our money. Let's buy it. Let's sell the graves for enough to cover our cost, and nobody was really looking at it as a money-making opportunity. Well, some people, some big organizations decided, no, we can start making these a moneymaker. And so they bought up a lot of the cemeteries. Well, they would buy them, and then they'd usually raise the price on them, so they did make money. They weren't run as kind of a community nonprofit.
Raise the price on them
On the
for the
grave?
new, or there's no upkeep or any charge you pay for it, other than your initial, what you buy it for, right?
You buy the grave, and then
Yeah.
you have to pay for the digging.
Right.
And usually there's not perpetual care. Usually, when you buy a grave in Michigan, 15%, I believe I'm right on that number,
15% of the property.
of what you pay. So you bought a grave for $1,000, $150 goes into an escrow account. And that's supposed to stay there, and only the interest off of that is used to maintain the cemetery. Because ultimately, if a cemetery goes defunct, the state of Michigan has to take
it
care of it.
over.
And they don't really want to run cemeteries, so they would take it over, they would sell it to somebody, and then somebody else would run it.
But if it's filled up, who's going to want to buy it? Because the money maker part of it is in selling the grave sites, right?
Well, grave sites, headstones, a lot of cemeteries will sell the grave markers, and the digging. Now, to the degree that less people are being buried today than it used to be 99% of people got buried.
Right, yeah.
Now it's about 50-50. It varies throughout the country. Some states, cremation is significantly more than burial, probably Florida, California, Alaska. Real conservative communities, Kentucky, Tennessee, Idaho, probably, maybe more burial. In Michigan, it's about 50-50. But there's a lot of different options.
Okay, so if the question, somebody decides, say I decide that I want to be buried. My mother's been cremated. That also is my father's plan. So if they wanted to be in with me when I'm buried, when you said the grave site is for one person to be buried, how does that work if you want to put the cremains of another person in a casket? How does that work?
Every cemetery can make their own rules.
Okay.
Most cemeteries allow you to have a 1 or 2 cremains. Some, I think, allow as many as 3 or 4 or 5 cremains. But it depends on the cemetery. But it would be very common that other family members could be buried on that same grave. Some people, like if you're going to be buried, you've got your parents' cremains, they could actually go in the casket with you.
Yeah.
Or your casket could get buried, and the urns could get buried on top of your casket in the same grave.
Kind of wanted it to be a family thing, right in there.
However you want to do it. And Some cemeteries don't, will have a small fee for allowing another person to be buried with you. Others, it can be significant. So before you make hard and fast plans,
Yes.
make a call to your funeral director or to the cemetery and ask them the question. So at least you know up front. Because sometimes it can make more sense to actually buy a second grave, even though
We
it
have
seems
4,
silly.
but we just wanted to be, But I have a question then. I mean, would they even know? I mean, obviously you put somebody in an urn, but I guess the question comes to cremains, and a lot of people just put them in the ocean or take them and put them at different spots where the people's favorite place was. So this has to be about money, right? It has nothing to do with the actual cremains.
Well, some cemeteries, like I said, will allow an extra cremation at no cost.
Right.
But if a cemetery has a high fee to put additional cremains with a casket of burial, or even just say it's 3 cremains,
Yeah.
some cemeteries charge you a lot for that second or third or fourth person in that grave. So you could, for example, you could put your parents, if your cemetery is going to charge you $1,000 extra for each of your parents' cremains, yes, you could put those cremains in your casket. Don't tell them about it. You wouldn't have to pay them that fee. But you also could never put their name on a headstone.
Oh,
Because the
yeah.
cemetery will not
Yeah, that's a
allow you.
detail.
They won't allow you to put a name of a person who's not officially buried at their cemetery. So it's a complicated decision, and that's why it's good to have a funeral director that you know and can find that stuff out for you, so you have your eyes fully open before you make those final decisions.
Well, and Stephen, when we were talking about pre-planning, that's something that you probably would want to talk to the family about too. I mean, I know we have the families that don't want to discuss it, but if you decide to at least make some decisions, you're further ahead than no decisions.
Correct.
Right?
Making the decisions in advance is priceless.
Yeah, I totally agree. So if somebody says we wanna pre-plan this funeral, and then one thing that we talked about in my office was the fact that if somebody is putting the money out for funerals, and people, like we talked about, very few people or funeral homes have been engaged in something that's not good, okay, but at some time, people would pre-plan a funeral, and like they would say, well, I'll do this or pay my taxes or whatever, and then I'll put it back later, and then, but they're very few and far between. Trust is a huge thing in a community like Jim, where you've been there for decades and you've been serving the public. Trust is absolutely essential. So, Stephen, when somebody prepays that funeral, what happens to the money?
The money, by Michigan state law,
Okay.
is held either through a third-party escrow agent, or it is held by a life insurance company. The funeral home is not holding any of your money per se. Checks are made payable directly to the third-party escrow agent or the life insurance company, whichever of the two venues you're choosing to have your prepaid money set aside. Those people are responsible for holding the money. Hence, if the funeral home would go out of business, retirement, sold to a new owner, the money is still held by the third party.
Okay, that's good to know. So, pre-planning a funeral, like I said, if you'd have pre-planned a funeral 20 years ago, you would have been far better off financially, and I don't see that changing. I don't see funerals going down. So is there a financial aspect to doing that also?
Very much so. By pre-planning a funeral today, you are inflation-proofing your funeral.
Not only that, for those people who are low income, Medicaid, that is one expense that the government allows you to pre-plan your funeral, because you know we're all going to be there someday, and that is one, rather than them saying the diversion of funds, they allow that as an expense, as a spend down to Medicaid. So say you need nursing home care, or you need something else, and you have $10,000 in the bank, and you know that is one expense, and you have to have less than 5 $100,000. That's one of the things that they allow as a prepaid funeral.
That is correct.
Yeah.
A prepaid funeral is exempt from Medicaid, meaning the state of Michigan cannot force you to cash out that funeral expense if it's in the third-party escrow agent or if it is held by the life insurance company.
Yeah, that's, for the listeners today, it is a huge thing to know that if you have a friend, neighbor, relative, or somebody you work with, unless somebody has about $10,000 a month forever, plus inflation growing, coming in.
I haven't won the Publishers
Well,
Clearinghouse yet.
Most of us don't have that kind of income coming
Yeah.
in, especially when you're older and you're probably retired. If you go into a long-term care facility, $8,000 or $9,000 is nothing, and I believe many places can be $10,000 or more
That's right.
Per month.
per month. Yes.
Yes.
So somebody could
6,000 is average.
Yes.
somebody could have $300,000, and I would call that a rich person. Well,
Yes.
you go into a long-term care facility 3-4 years, that money is gone.
That's right.
So if there's one thing they should do, it's to prepay their funeral. Let's make the example simple. Let's say somebody has $80,000 and the nursing home's $8,000. That means in 10 months, they're down to zero.
Right.
You can apply to Medicaid when you're down to $2,000. You can apply just before, and then when you get to $2,000, they can put you in.
Yes.
So if you paid for a funeral, and let's keep it easy, let's say it was $8,000, that means you're going to qualify 1 month earlier.
Yes.
Uncle Sam, Medicaid will start kicking in 1 month earlier,
Yeah.
but your funeral's paid for. If you don't prepay that funeral, then grandma dies, and then she has no money because it all got spent up. At most, she has the $2,000, and that'll get spent up on hairdos and new pajamas and other little incidentals she might have in the nursing care. Then the kids are passing the hat to pay for grandma's funeral. When had they just known 6 months earlier they could have prepaid it,
That's right.
it would be like getting a free funeral because it essentially didn't cost you anything because her money's
The
going to
money
get
was
spent
going
up.
regardless.
It's going to get spent one way or the other.
That's right.
So anybody who is in a long-term care facility who doesn't have huge monthly income should prepay their funeral because there is no downside to prepaying it. You can move, you can get a refund, you can transfer it to a new funeral home, you could gift it. Let's say you decided you were never going to die and you never needed a funeral or who knows what, you could give your funeral account to some other family member, or you could prepay your funeral and somebody else dies and they have no money, you could say, well, I'm going to give up my funeral and let that go to somebody else.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we've had that where somebody in their 60s or 70s prepaid a funeral and then their 20-year-old grandchild died in a car crash. Parents had no money, nobody had any money, and grandma says, hey, have my funeral, you can pick out a blue casket instead of my pink casket, and I'll save up the money and buy my own funeral again someday. So you have tremendous flexibility what to do with that funeral account. Essentially, you can't lose. You can
Right.
you can gain almost a free funeral if Medicaid's an issue. You can lock in the price.
Yeah.
So a funeral that might be $8,000 a day might be $18,000, might be $28,000 by the time we die.
Right.
So you lock that in. And
I mean, you got to admit, okay, everybody's going to get there, right?
I
So
think
it's
so.
not like you're saying, well, we better do this now because people are going to stop dying. That's not going to happen,
Well,
right? So it goes to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, people
Common
buy
sense.
life insurance. I mean, buy fire insurance, and most of us don't have fires, but we buy fire insurance to protect ourselves.
Right.
Funerals we're all going to need, so it's a matter: are you going to choose to pay for it and get it set now, or are you going to choose not to and let your family members scramble when the time comes? So there's just lots of positives. The fact of the matter is, it's not a comfortable thing to talk about or think about, and we are all procrastinators.
But guess what? The comfort comes afterwards because you deal with the process and then you can get it off your mind and feel that you've done the best thing for your family.
Yeah, one less thing to worry about, right? We can't control everything in our lives. We can't hardly control many things in our lives.
Right.
But that is something we can control, and it is one less thing to worry about. So when we meet families, they're usually very nervous talking about it. They're uncomfortable talking about it. Nobody likes writing checks. But once they're done, they go, phew,
What a relief.
that wasn't so hard.
Yes.
I feel so much better that if a bus hit my wife and I tomorrow.
Yeah.
Our kids don't have to wonder, do I want to be buried or cremated? What funeral home? 1 day or 3 days?
Yeah.
Church, no church? It's all settled, and the kids can focus on supporting each other and picking up, Uncle Frank from the airport, not having to be picking out all those details.
Absolutely. Okay, so if, say we have viewers who are deciding, yes, that's right, I'm not going to put it off, I'm going to pre-plan my funeral. Is there something that they can get ahead of time that talks about the decisions they have to make? Do they come in and meet with you initially and then go home and talk about it? Obviously, it has a lot to do with how much the funeral will be. So how can they prepare to pre-plan, I guess is my question.
The answer would be yes and yes. Yes, they can. Well, first, probably they need to know what funeral home they're going to deal with. And if they have a funeral home they got a good relationship with, great. If they don't, go visit a couple and get to know them and be somewhere that you're real comfortable with.
And talk to other people in the
Talk
community.
to people in the community,
Yeah.
get recommendations. That's a tremendous thing to do. Many funeral homes on their website would have a list of information you may want to bring.
Okay,
If
that
you're a
helps.
real planner and you're a list maker, feel free to do that. If you don't like doing those things, just come in and talk to the funeral director. We're going to make it easy. We're just going to ask you some questions, get some biographical information, talk about the funeral. What do you want to do? What do you not want to do? Explain options, go over costs. And almost always people will take that info, go home, think about it, talk about it, discuss it, and then come back and finalize it. Or we'll handle, let's say we help a woman handle her husband's funeral. She might come back a month or a year later and say, guess what, I want the same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe change the flowers and maybe change the color of the casket, but everything else is the same.
Right.
And then it's pretty darn easy for her.
Well, Stephen, I have one question for you before we close. If somebody decides they want to pre-plan and they don't have all the money they need, can they do a payment plan?
Definitely. Definitely. We can take payment plans up to 20 years in certain circumstances on a monthly basis. Payment plans could either come from a checking account,
Like
a savings
auto
account,
deduct?
electronic fund transfer, auto deduct.
Great.
Or, goodness, even off a MasterCard or Visa. That way you can get those reward points for going ahead and prepaying on your funeral to be able to travel.
Well, something that people would think about is I don't have $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 right now, but that shouldn't stop them.
Correct.
If they want to prepay a funeral, then they can go ahead and make arrangements with that funeral home. It's where do you want to go? What funeral home do you want to do? And pretty much, and maybe whether you want to be cremated or buried, and then you're good to go with the rest of the decision. Just make the initial contact.
Right. And the beautiful thing is they don't even need to come into the funeral home. I make the majority of my appointments at people's homes because where most
They're more
decisions
comfortable
made
there.
at their right at their kitchen table or dining room table.
Okay.
So yeah, it's all a comfort factor. The last thing we want to do is make this traumatic to any families whatsoever.
And it's a lot less traumatic if you do it ahead of time.
Very much so, especially for those people that are left behind. Again, the person who's not there,
Yeah.
they don't have to worry about it. They're in a much better place. It's those people that are left behind that are saying, oh my goodness, what do we do?
Why did mom and dad leave me with this?
What do you think they would have wanted?
Yes. No, I agree 100%. And I hope that A, we brought a little bit of comfort to the viewers, and B, enough information so that they know if I want to do this, I'm not going to put it off. I know what to do. So Stephen, thank you. Jim, thank you for being our guest today.
Once again, Barbara, thank you for having us here. We truly appreciate it. Keep up your good work with the fine citizens of the city of Westland.
Thank you. I love my job. So thank you, and thank you, friends in the viewing audience, for being with us today.